I have the pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Shelby Rosasco, who is an assistant professor at the University of Wyoming. She is also the chair of the Beef Reproduction Task Force, and she is going to be speaking to us on how pre- and post-breeding nutrition can improve your reproductive success. Thank you, Nikki, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys this morning and get to talk to you about nutrition and reproduction. I think the last day and a half has really set up my talk and thinking about, how important nutrition is. I don't know that there was a single talk the last couple days where somebody didn't mention nutrition and how important that is to fertility and getting heifers synchronized and all those kind of things. And so there is going to be a little overlap in my talk between some of the previous talks, which is natural when you're talking about nutrition. But I'm going to try to focus on that time period after those animals have calved and at the start of the breeding season, and just some things we can think about to get those animals not only bred, but also from a longevity standpoint, how we can get those animals set up. And so if we take a big picture view just for a few minutes, I think all of us in this room really understand the importance of reproduction, right? We know that reproductive performance is critically important to profitability within a cow-calf operation, right? We need those calves on the ground. I thought that was a great slide that Bob Weber had talking about crossbreeding and the value of those calves and those kind of things. So getting those calves on the ground is incredibly important. Unfortunately, even though we've done years and years worth of research, we have not figured out quite how to get 100% reproduction and not have those open cows. And so reproductive failure is the largest reason that cows are culled. Some USDA data from 2017 reported 40.5% of cows culled for pregnancy status, which means that we do have to replace those animals, right? Every year, we're going to have some cows falling out of the herd. We're going to have to replace those animals. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about the replacement heifers because we didn't have a true heifer development talk. And I'm biased, that's where my research interest is, so I had to sneak a little bit of heifer development stuff in the slide set here. And so when we're thinking about that, we also need to bring in the economic side, right? We know that reproduction is incredibly important, the nutrition is incredibly important, but what's the economic ramifications? And so if you go back in the literature, the net revenue from 6 calves is needed to cover development and production costs of replacement heifers. And so we hear different numbers batted around. I think the panel yesterday talked about, traditionally we say 3 to 5 calves. That's obviously very dependent on your development situation for those animals. With calf prices right now, that might be lower than the net revenue of 6 calves, which is great. We're breaking even on those heifers earlier. They're turning us a profit earlier. The other thing I want to think about is challenges, right? And so we know, again, profitable cow-calf operation should have a high percentage calf crop each year. Getting those calves on the ground is incredibly important. And I know it was mentioned yesterday in several talks that we need to have those cows maintaining a 365-day calving interval. Well, if we have a 280-day gestation period, that means that we have 80 to 85 days to get those animals rebred. That's not a very big window, especially when we think about our young cows. Those 2- and 3-year-old cows, I know Dr. Hall mentioned it in the last talk, but they're going to have an even higher nutrient requirement and a bigger hurdle for us to get over because they still have a growth requirement. And so it's incredibly important that we consider that as a challenge. And we know that nutrition is going to be a really, really big factor in getting us over that challenge, okay? And so yesterday, as well as this morning, several speakers have mentioned the importance of body condition scoring. That's our best way to track how our nutrition program's doing. We know that body condition scoring at calving is an important factor in success during the breeding season. And so getting those animals in the right body condition score at calving is going to be very, very helpful. That's going to be a big determinant, and I'll show you some data in a bit on the postpartum interval and how long that recovery period takes. But we also know that we want those cows to continue to recover and gain weight before the breeding season. So once they've calved, we still need those cows in a good plane of nutrition, hopefully on a positive plane of nutrition, because that's going to have a big impact on conception rates, right? So that body condition score at calving is determining their postpartum interval, the nutrition we have before breeding is going to help influence that conception rate. Now, if I take a big picture view of reproduction for just a second, I promise we'll start talking about nutrition. It's not just going to be all interest stuff. But several years ago, Vitor Mercadante, who used to be the chair of this committee, had this definition of reproductive efficiency in one of his slides, and I swiped it out of his slide set because I thought it did a really good job of characterizing not only that we want really good reproductive performance, but that we're trying to optimize pregnancy rates early in the breeding season. And that keyword there is optimize, right? We want those cows bred early, but we have to have an optimum level of nutrition, okay, to get them there. We don't want to overfeed those cows or have to push them too hard. And we want to select and develop replacement heifers that are highly fertile at the lowest cost possible. And we're going to get into both of those things, how we can hopefully optimize those pregnancy rates early from a nutrition standpoint, as well as thinking about developing those heifers at a fairly reasonable cost that are highly fertile for a long period of time. And so when we jump into the relationship between nutrition and reproduction, if I really just went and got in the weeds on the nutrition side of things, we could be up here for 3 or 4 hours. I promise I don't have that many slides. Okay, I'll try to keep it at that 45, 50-minute mark. But we know that nutrition is an important mediator of reproductive events. On the heifer side, puberty attainment. On that cow side, has an important role in controlling that anestrus or that postpartum interval. We know it's going to influence conception. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on longevity and retention, because how we manage those animals nutritionally can impact their ability to stay in the herd. And so I want to take a little bit of a different approach. You've seen several slides that showed here's the nutrient requirements in a table format, okay, and we need to think about the nutrition. And so I did my PhD and master's at New Mexico State University and had the opportunity to work with Dr. Eric Scholler-Gerdes, who's spoken at this conference several times. And I borrowed this slide from him because I think it does a really good job illustrating how we need to think about nutrition in our grazing cattle. And so what this slide is showing is this is data from their research center in Corona, New Mexico, and it's 18 years worth of forage samples taken from the cannulated animals at that research center. And so that it's got so the lowest forage value for crude protein for this case, the highest forage value, and then that kind of burnt orange line is going to be the average, okay? And what I've done is overlaid the NRC requirements for the cow, okay? The blue boxes are indicating kind of their production timeline. So they breed in May and June, and then they're going to calve in February and March. So those are important time points for them, okay? Just to kind of highlight that. But you can kind of see if, as we lay that line of nutrient requirements over, the part of the year we are meeting their crude protein requirement with the forage, right? And so the forage is doing a good job. Even in New Mexico, where things can get a little drier, the forage isn't quite as good. Okay, they maybe don't have quite as much forage available. Okay, it is meeting those requirements, but then there's part of the year where we're not necessarily meeting those requirements. And that's where we need to think about how we correct that imbalance. Okay, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, especially on the protein side of things. The one that always shocks people, and I know he shocks people when he shows this one, is on the energy side, okay? And so when we lay those NRC requirements for the cow over that graph that's showing the TDM percent in those masticate samples, it never meets that requirement, okay? Now that's not to say that they have to supplement 365 days a year to correct that deficiency, okay? I think there's 2 things to think about on this slide. One is that those cows that are out on rangeland, it is very, very hard to classify their nutrient requirements, right? And so we have a really hard time from a research standpoint classifying the nutrient requirements of a grazing animal and the adaptability of a grazing animal. And so I don't think that nutrient requirement line totally accounts for that, right? We don't have the data to account for that. And the other thing to think about is that with some protein supplementation in the protein in the forage, depending on how it is, we can somewhat help correct that energy deficiency there as well. So I promise, unless it's a drought year, they're not supplementing every day. I got to work there for 6 years, and we weren't feeding those cows every day, okay? So on that same line, this has been mentioned, we need to think about okay, the dietary nutrients that are available, and then how that animal is going to use them. First thing she's going to use that nutrient for is going to be her vital function, so her basal maintenance requirements. Okay, she's also then going to use that, whatever's left, for gestation and lactation, depending on which stage of production she's in. If she's a young cow, then she's going to start thinking about growth, right? And that's just adding to that pile of the nutrients we're trying to meet. And you can see kind of way down there towards the bottom, then she's thinking about reproduction. And so not only do we need to make sure we're meeting those maintenance requirements, or requirements for lactation and growth, but also that we're meeting that requirement so that she can start cycling again, and so that she can perform from a reproduction and fertility standpoint. And so I couldn't not have some body condition score stuff in there, so I think you guys hopefully have figured out that body condition scoring at calving is incredibly important. So if that's not written somewhere on the notes you're taking or something, hopefully you've remembered that. So what I've done here is compiled several studies. There's certainly a lot out there. If you did a Google search for studies looking at body condition scoring at calving and pregnancy rates and reproduction, there would be a lot of literature to read through. But what we can see is that in these studies, as that body condition score increases from a 4 to a 5 and even up to a 6, we see a nice increase in pregnancy rate in response to those cattle. And so even though, again, the nutrition is important before the breeding season, we need to be thinking about nutrition far earlier than that. Okay? To me, nutrition or fertility is not a one-time event. We need to be thinking about that animal's fertility 365 days of the year, and making sure we're getting her in the right condition, keeping her in the right condition, moving forward. And that's going to make our job a little bit easier once she calves, right? Her highest nutrient requirements are after she calves, when she's in lactation. And so if she's in poor body condition before then, we're already behind the 8 ball, okay? We're going to have a hard time getting her to put on weight and get up to a condition score that we need. And so the other one I wanted to talk about is this study from Carvalho and others in 2022. This is an Indicus cattle. I know there's not quite as many Indicus cattle here, but I think the concept is really the same in our Taurus cattle and the cattle we have in this area of the world. And so what they did was they classified cows as either below or above a body condition score 5 at calving. And then post-calving, they put them on 3 different nutritional treatments. Those cattle were either set to lose weight, to maintain that condition, or on a positive plan of nutrition to hopefully gain some condition and gain some body weight. In those animals that were below a 5, what we see is that those animals that lost weight, their pregnancy rate at time day I was only 24%. I don't think any of us would be very happy if we had a pregnancy rate of 24%. You would be calling and worried, and that's when the extension specialists and educators start getting calls and how can we fix this and what happened, and we're troubleshooting, okay? We do see those pregnancy rates are a little higher in those that at least maintained, if not gained weight. Those animals that gained weight, we get over 40 there. But those animals that started above a body condition score 5, even those that lost weight, so she started at a 5, she was on the nutritional treatment to lose weight, she had a tendency for a greater pregnancy rate than those animals that were below a 5 and gained weight, okay? And so even though body condition scoring and nutrition is very, very important, I'm saying that wrong, but even though nutrition before the breeding season is very important to conception, if we're kind of behind the 8 ball, it's going to be really hard to play catch up and get them to somewhat this more acceptable level up here in the 60%, high 50, 60% area. Okay, so body condition score at calving determines the body condition score at the start of the breeding season. It's very, very hard to put weight on those animals, especially when we're thinking about this environment where we do get a little cold. If I think about when I'm home in Wyoming, we get a little cold, it gets a little windy. It's very, very hard to put condition on those cattle. Recovering body condition score after calving does not fully compensate for a thin body condition score at that calving time point. I do want to challenge you a little bit. And so if I go back to some New Mexico data, what about the adaptability of cows to their production environment? Because I do think, that's an incredibly important thing for us to think about. I think it got mentioned yesterday afternoon from Dr. Wallman. It certainly got mentioned this morning in the genetics talks, is the adaptability of those cows to that environment. And so what they did in the study was they had young cows and they classified them based on their body condition score at that calving time point. So you can see they had 4s, 5s, and 6s. This was done in New Mexico at that Corona Range and Livestock Research Center by Dr. Travis Molnix when he was down there. But what's important is when you start looking at this reproduction data is days to first postpartum ovulation was the same, right? 84, 82, and 80, okay? That kind of contradicts the data I showed you a few slides ago, right? Pregnancy rate was 92, 91, and 90%. Very acceptable pregnancy rates in those cattle, whether they were body condition score 4, 5, or 6, okay? Now, what I didn't tell you is at this research center, they have spent a very long time weeding out those cows that can't handle it at a body condition score 4. They put a lot of selection pressure on those animals to perform in their environment, and so it's been decades of selection for those cattle that perform in that somewhat limited feed environment, okay? So this is not a slide for me to tell you your cows are normally at a 6, you can drop them to a 4 and everything's going to be fine, okay? You're going to call me and be really, really mad if you do that. But I think if we put selection pressure on those cows over time, we can get it to where they can perform adequately at that lower body condition score, which I think is important for us to think about, is those cows fit in the environment, placing that selection pressure slowly on them over time, okay? I want to jump in, and I'm not going to talk about a lot of fat and energy just for time's sake, and I think Dr. Hall did a really nice job talking about that a little bit, and I want to talk about protein, right? Because when you think about correcting that protein deficiency we see, we're also somewhat correcting an energy deficiency, okay? So there was a really great extension publication from Clay Mathis several years ago, and he had this graph in there, and what this graph is looking at is crude protein content within the forage and forage dry matter intake in relationship to that. And what we see is when forage crude protein gets below that 7% threshold, we see a pretty drastic decrease over time in dry matter intake. And so that's where we need to correct that protein deficiency. And by correcting that protein deficiency, we're going to get that dry matter intake back up to the level that it needs to be. And we can actually somewhat correct the energy deficiency as well, right? And so that's what the table on this next slide is talking about. Is if, okay, we know we have a protein deficiency, our forage is less than 7% crude protein, I'm going to provide a protein supplement. We can actually drastically improve forage intake with the protein content of the supplement we're using, okay? And so if we're using a supplement that has greater than 30% crude protein in it, we will actually see a 44% improvement in forage intake. So as long as we're not in a limited forage environment, right, we're not in a drought, we have plenty of forage available, we're improving their digestibility, we're improving passage rate, they're able to have a higher intake, and that's going to help correct that energy deficiency. So oftentimes we can help correct that energy deficiency by correcting that protein deficiency. Hopefully that's making sense to everybody and you're following me there. Now I will say if we're in a limited feed environment, obviously I don't want to increase intake, right? If we're in a drought, which seems to happen pretty frequently, unfortunately, we don't want to drive that forage intake, and so we want to be very cognizant of that fact. If we use a crude protein supplement that has 20% or less, we're not going to drive that, and part of that is we're also going to increase the energy because that supplement typically has a higher energy content into it. So when they're making those supplements to meet that protein level, the ingredients they're going to use are going to be lower in crude protein, okay, and so that supplement, 20% cake, is going to naturally have a little bit higher TDN and energy value than we see in a 32% supplement. The other thing we need to think about, I'm going to get into this a little bit here, is how they're utilizing that protein. So I promise we're not going through a nutrition lesson. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm a repro person that just dabbles in nutrition enough to have a little fun, okay? Is that dietary crude protein coming in is going to be split into two fractions, okay? So we're going to have that ruminantly degradable protein, and we do have a requirement for that, because if you guys remember when we're feeding cattle, we're feeding really two entities, right? We're feeding that animal, and we're also feeding the microbes in the rumen, okay? And we have a significant requirement for that ruminantly degradable protein. Those microbes are going to use that and create VFAs and byproducts. That animal is going to use that microbe as protein once it passes through her system. But we also have a requirement for ruminantly undegradable protein, so bypass protein. Dr. Hall referred to it as UIP earlier, so same thing, just different terms. Okay, sorry to be confusing. Both of those fractions together, so the bypass protein, the RUP, and the microbial protein that we're getting are going to come together, and that's going to be what's supplied to those tissues. Okay, we're going to consider that metabolizable protein. And so the important part that we're thinking about, even though we balance majority of the time for crude protein, what we want to be thinking about is what's supplied to the tissues. And we want to make sure we're not only feeding the microbe, but that we have a good supply of undegradable bypass protein going to that animal, because they're also going to use some of those products for energy as well. And so some really interesting study. This is a study from Dr. Travis Mullinex. Again, when he was at New Mexico, I promise I don't just have New Mexico data in here. There's data from other places in here. It's just some interesting work that they've done. This is a heifer development study. So those heifers were put on some post-weaning diets. The 36 RUP and the 50 RUP were developed grazing native range. And then they either received a supplement they were isonitrogenous, but they had either 50% bypass protein or 36% bypass protein, and then they had their control treatment, which was heifers developed in the dry lot. Okay, and so we see at the start of the breeding season, those range developed heifers were both at about 51% mature body weight. The dry lot developed heifers were at 58%. Okay, you see that reflected here in those weights at breeding. But what's really interesting to me is the pregnancy rates. Okay, so we see no difference in those pregnancy rates, maybe a little bit of a numerical trend for an increase in pregnancy rates in those 50 heifers. Okay, we look at Julian date thinking, okay, well, these are overall pregnancy rates. Maybe those range developed heifers just got bred later, right? They didn't get bred early. The Julian calving date is actually not statistically different and the same across those. And so those heifers got bred and calved at a similar time. Again, saying that not only can we develop those heifers to a little bit lighter weight, but certainly maybe there's some advantages there. The cool part of this data that I really want to highlight is the long-term implications. Okay, is that not only did that 50% RUP supplement do a great job developing those heifers on range, but when we follow these animals out over time, over 4 breeding seasons, what we start to see is those heifers that were developed with a higher percent bypass protein within that supplement have an improvement in retention rate and pregnancy rates over time. Okay, and I think that's really, really important. So that improved supply of bypass protein is doing something very beneficial to fertility and reproduction. So they've actually kind of been chasing this down a little bit. There at New Mexico, I think Travis has continued that work when he was here in Nebraska as well. Now that he's in Oregon, trying to figure out exactly the function and the mechanism behind that. But very, very cool that we can try to pick supplements that have a better bypass protein. And so we can pick things like distiller's grain. We can pick things that have some feather meal or things like that in them that are going to have a higher percentage of bypass protein and potentially have a really nice, not only short-term effect, but long-term effect. I also thought this was a really interesting study done a while back here in the Sandhills of Nebraska by Trey Patterson. And so what they did was, this was actually in a commercial herd. They wanted to see, is there a difference if we balance the diet and the supplement for those animals on a crude protein basis or a metabolizable protein basis? And so what they were seeing was, is there a difference if I try to fine-tune that nutritional management down and really think about how much protein is not only just supplied to the animal, but how much protein is getting absorbed in the small intestine and available to that animal? And what they see, again, that bypass protein is helping provide key amino acids, so we're making sure we're meeting that need. Is a really nice response in overall pregnancy rates. There's a 5% difference, so a 5% increase in those animals where we balance that diet on a metabolizable protein basis versus a crude protein basis. And again, I think 86, I don't know that any of us would be super mad at that pregnancy rate, depending on the year. But I think we've gotten to this point where we know how to feed cattle really well. You guys know how to feed cattle really well. Where can we make fine tweaks to help continue to increase that nutrition and help increase that fertility and reproductive rate? And again, I think making sure that we have adequate protein being supplied to those tissues can be very, very important here. And so I want to jump in and talk about the heifers. We didn't end up with a true heifer development talk this year. And again, I'm a little biased. That's where my research tends to lie. So I want to highlight a little bit of that. But I also think they're an important consideration from a pre-breeding standpoint, okay? And so you guys have probably all heard heifer talks, whether you've seen me give a heifer talk before, or even at an extension thing where we talk about this target body weight approach, okay? This guideline for replacement heifers to reach 60 to 65% of their mature body weight by breeding. That's a very, very well-established number. Nothing wrong with that number, but I've spent a lot of time in the western half of the U.S. where sometimes pushing those heifers to 60-65% can be a challenge, especially when we think about extensive arid rangelands. It's just a big challenge, and it's also a big expense, right? To supplement and feed those heifers to get to that level can be costly for us. Now, if you can easily do that, I don't think restrict the heifers back. I think you let them develop to that rate. Nothing wrong with it. Very, very acceptable rate. But there's been a lot of research done here in Nebraska by Dr. Funston and his group, as well as down in New Mexico and some other places that really tried to challenge that and ask the question of, can we reduce development costs? Okay, can we do that by either developing heifers to a lighter percent mature body weight, or could we potentially do that by putting those heifers out on range, utilizing winter range or corn residue, being a little creative with how we develop those heifers? And they certainly found that we could do that. And I think Rick showed some of that data yesterday morning. We can do that, reduce development costs, and not impair reproductive function in those animals. The other thing I think is important to think about is we talked about adaptability. Dr. Lallman talked about it. We talked about it this morning. I want to make sure that those heifers are going to do well when I put them in a production environment. And so I would challenge you to kind of think about, if I'm going to ask that cow to go out and graze and be on a forage-based diet for the rest of her life, okay? If I develop her in a dry lot, I push her to a body condition score 6, and she's never going to see that again, am I setting her up to be successful? We know that grazing is a learned behavior. Am I better off to have her out on range, grazing where she's learning, okay, and maybe I'm not pushing her quite as hard. Maybe I'm treating her a little bit more like my cows. And I know we've talked about the importance of getting heifers bred early. And if you go back and you really evaluate some of the research that we did, some of those heifers aren't pubertal at the start of the breeding season and don't get as bred early. But I would challenge you to kind of ask, is my ideal heifer the heifer that can perform in my environment and get bred early? Am I weeding out a couple of those heifers that have to be at that higher body condition score, have to get to that 65% mature body weight in order to get bred? Or is she going to be that animal that falls out as a young cow because nutrition's gotten hard, maintenance requirements have gone up, all of those kind of things? So I don't think there's one right way to develop heifers. I think they can both be good. I just want to challenge you to think about that a little bit. The other thing to think about is the influence of timing to gain, especially on the heifer side. There's certainly more studies than I can fit on this one slide, but a table of several of those studies where they've manipulated the timing of gain. And in all of those studies, we can see whether we use an even gain or a late gain system, even if we use an early gain type system where we push them to gain a lot of weight right after weaning and then maintain them, we see similar reproductive performance in all of those different studies. And I think you can do what works with your environment. It works really good for you to maybe push gain early. You certainly can do that. If it works really well for you to hold off. If I think about Wyoming, it is really hard to get heifers to gain weight when it is below freezing, the wind's blowing. They just, even if they're eating a lot, they're barely meeting those requirements, okay? And so we got to think about maybe a late gain system's good. As that forage starts to green up, as those heifers start to take off, maybe I can take advantage of that compensatory gain. And that's the point I kind of make here on this slide with some data from Lynch and others in 1997. Again, we're using a late gain system. You'll hear me kind of refer to as a stair-step system here in a second. But they maintained those heifers pretty slow from November to March, and then they really increased gain there at the end, right before the breeding season. No difference in pregnancy rates in those animals. The authors also added in there that they may have decreased development costs. Now, they didn't do the economic analysis, so there's no guarantee. But why they said that is because with that late gain system, when they're still gaining, but they're gaining slow, and then we step them up, we utilize compensatory gain. Okay, and so we've talked, and you've heard efficiency brought up a lot of time. That compensatory gain, they're utilizing those nutrients, we're providing them more efficiently, and they're going to outperform what we calculate when we do the ration on the computer. Okay, they're going to gain more efficiently, gain more weight than we anticipate there, and utilize those feed resources more efficiently, which I think is a really great thing. On that stair step side of things, I want to not talk about pregnancy rates the whole time, but talk about this late gain or the stair step system in reference to longevity. Okay, and so this is some research that was done here in Nebraska at US Mark by Dr. Fruitley and Dr. Cushman. And what they were doing was looking at developing those heifers either on a constant rate of gain post-weaning to the pre-breeding time point, or a stair-step system, so a lower rate of gain for half the development period and then step them up. And instead of breeding them, they OVEX those heifers at the end and looked at the ovarian reserve. And so Dr. Hall mentioned earlier what that ovarian reserve is. That's that pool of follicles that heifer has to use over her entire lifetime. Okay, so it would make sense that if she has a larger ovarian reserve, she would likely have better longevity, right? We see improved reproductive performance and fertility in those heifers as well. Okay, so when they did that, these heifers were in the dry lot, we saw that those stair-step developed heifers had a larger number of primordial follicles, which are the microscopic follicle number. That's that ovarian reserve pool. Okay, so we were able to increase or slow how fast we were using those primordial follicles. So what they speculate is this would potentially improve longevity in those heifers and performance in those heifers. I wasn't happy with just that answer, and I was in New Mexico at the time finishing my PhD. And so at the time I thought it'd be really, really fun to redo this study, but add a twist to it and put half of those heifers out on pasture, right? Because not all of us are developing heifers in a dry lot setting. We have a lot of people that are developing heifers out on pasture. So if I'm out on pasture, could I still use a stair-step system and see a similar result? And so this was a lot of time individually feeding heifers, bringing heifers in, all kinds of fun things. But what we saw was similar results to what Fruitley and Amundsen saw in the dry lot, where those stair-step heifers had an increased number of primordial follicles. What was interesting was in our native range heifers, those stair-step developed heifers followed a similar suit, okay? And I wasn't sure, because it is very hard to get heifers to do exactly what you want when they're out on range. They kind of tell you, I'm going to eat whatever I want, however much I want. And so it was very hard to get them to do that. But what was also interesting was these constant gain heifers that were out on native range were intermediate, okay? And I did throw the body weight slides in here just for time's sake, but those, if you looked at the body weight, we had a nice green up that spring in New Mexico, and we saw those native range heifers really take off. And both treatments somewhat followed a stair-step style system, okay? And so I think that was a really cool response. Again, we think it may result in an increase in longevity. Dr. Fruitley kind of beat me to it, but he was able to actually leave ovaries in the heifers, because that's kind of an important part if we're going to look at actual longevity and pregnancy rates over time. Look at herd survival, and found that herd survival is greater in those stair-step developed heifers. And so there is something to that, improving, delaying that gain until later. It is translating to a better herd survival in those animals, which makes me really excited. I've continued some of this research now that I'm over in Wyoming. My graduate student Blake, who's around here, has a poster on some of that work, so feel free to go torture him about what he's doing, ask him lots of hard questions, okay? The other time point that I want us to consider is post-breeding, okay? So hopefully you've kind of seen there's a lot of ways that we can do pre-breeding nutrition. We want them on that positive plane of nutrition going into the breeding season, but we can't forget about what happens either after we open the gate after AI, after we turn that bull out, okay? Because it's still really, really important. And that should make sense when we think about the time course for early bovine embryo development, is there's a lot of really important things happening early in this time period, okay? And before we have attachment, which isn't going to happen until down here at day 19, roughly, okay, they're relying on secretions from that uterine environment. And so what we're feeding them is really, really important. It's important the whole time, but it's going to be really, really important here. And you especially see this in the heifer side where maybe we've developed those heifers in the dry lot, we breed them, everything's great, and then we do what? We open the gate and turn them out on pasture, right? And even though the pasture's green and looks great and the nutrition should be fine, that's still a change in nutrition, right? And that's exactly some of the research that Dr. Perry saw when he was up in South Dakota. So the study that's over here on the left side, we see they developed heifers either out on pasture or range or in the dry lot. They were developed to 65% mature body weight. We see that 94, 97% had attained puberty at the start of the breeding season, so everything should be good to go. They were synchronized in AI very similarly, but those dry lot heifers were turned out onto pasture post-breeding. And what we see is a 10% reduction in AI conception rates. I don't know about you, I would not be happy with a 10% reduction in AI pregnancy rates, and we'll talk about maybe how to fix that here in a second, okay? See some similar data from ARIAs and others that was done, 2 locations, Wyoming and then at Purdue, where they did a similar thing. Heifers were developed, they're 60-65% mature body weight, and then they had them on 3 different treatments. The gain treatment is actually those heifers continuing on that positive rate of gain, okay? The maintain is they drop those heifers to a maintenance level, okay? So they stop those heifers from gaining weight, and then the lose is those heifers were put at about 80-85% maintenance requirements, okay? And even when we dropped those heifers, we're still meeting their basal requirements, okay? But we dropped the plane of nutrition in those heifers. We see a decrease in first service conception rates across both locations in those, okay? So we want to not only keep those heifers meeting maintenance requirements, we want to keep them on that positive, similar plane of nutrition. We see that again when we look at impacts on embryo quality, okay? That we want that if we put those heifers where we're losing weight, okay, we've bred them, now they're in a negative energy balance, they're losing weight, we see a decrease in embryo stage, a decrease in embryo quality, a decrease in the total cells, as well as the percent live cells in those animals. And so, again, I think this kind of touches on that early time point that maybe Dr. Hall left to me, is that we need to make sure that we're continuing to think about nutrition during the breeding season. It's not, okay, AI's done, I put the bowl out, everything's good. It's making sure that we're meeting that, right? Think about your calving systems here, right? Some of you are using a May calving system here. Think about how that forage is at that May time point. Are we meeting those requirements? Do they maybe need a little supplementation to get them through that time point? Maybe is there a way to correct that, right? Maybe I have to develop the heifers in the dry lot. That's the resources I have. That's what's most economically efficient. And then I have to move them out to pasture, or I have to put cattle out onto a lease or something like that. Dr. Perry did some follow-up work where we do see that we can provide some supplement. In this case, it was some dry distiller's grains supplement. And when we put those heifers out on pasture with the supplement, we see a recovery of that conception rate occur there, okay? So we can correct that problem without having to just leave them in the dry lot or not touch anything during that early part of the period. We just want to make sure we're helping them through that transition out onto pasture, okay? So take-home messages, okay? Fertility is not a one-time event, okay? Hopefully you guys have gotten that from the last day and a half, is that fertility is something we need to be thinking about throughout the year, okay? It has an impact on the future progeny. That's what Dr. Hall talked about, okay? We know that body condition score is important, so we need to think about post-weaning, getting those animals into a good body condition score so when they calve, we're not behind the 8 ball, okay? We can make sure they're on a positive plane of nutrition, okay? Also consider the nutritional requirements that they're going to be facing once they calve, okay? Especially in those young cows. The lactation requirement, depending on your genetics, can be pretty high, okay? Also consider this matching our nutrient requirements to the forage quality, really, really important there. Fixing that protein deficiency that we're going to see. On the heifer side of things, I know I kept that short, on the heifer development side, but can we use things like a stair-step nutritional program? Can we use some bypass protein to help influence not only pregnancy rates that first year, but set her up for a lifetime of success? And then consistency between pre and post-breeding nutritional management is key. One plug before I wrap it up and I hand the mic back over to Nikki. This is a range beef cow symposium year, so those of you that are in boarding states already probably have been emailing or calling me and trying to figure out when that's going to be. That program is going to be November 10th and 11th in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Registration should be up the end of this week, so once I get home tomorrow, that should go up on the site end of this week, early next week. But that website has all the information available. And then feel free to contact me, guys, if you guys have any questions.